The kitchen floor was cold against my cheek, but colder was the silence from the man I once called my brother. Blood trickled from my lip, a coppery warmth contrasting the chill of betrayal. He didn't kneel, didn't ask if I was okay. He just stepped over me, careful not to stain his loafers, and walked out. A message blinked on my cracked phone screen. Stay away from us. 4 words that shattered a lifetime of loyalty. I was Evelyn Carter, the one who paid the bills, co-signed the mortgage on their dream house, and took in his fiancée like family. But kindness is a currency quickly spent in a rigged game. That night, I made a promise, not of revenge, but rebirth. I would show them what it looks like when the woman you buried digs her way out, quietly, powerfully, and without asking permission. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 59 years old, and for most of my life, I've been the person everyone turned to when things fell apart. The dependable one, the fixer, the silent support beam holding up the fragile walls of my family. And for years, I didn't question it. I believed that if I just gave enough, money, time, love, anyone would stay, that I'd finally earn my place in the family I'd spent my life supporting. Brandon was my little brother. I raised him more than I raised myself. Our parents weren't around long enough to care. Our mother died when I was 19, and our father was more ghost than man long before he left. I got my first full-time job at 20, not because I wanted a career, but because Brandon needed new shoes, hot meals, and someone to show up at his parent-teacher conferences. I didn't complain when I covered his tuition. I clapped louder than anyone when he got his first job, even though I was the one who paid for the interview suit. I cheered when he introduced Melinda to the family, that wide-eyed girl with perfect posture and a smile as polished as her resume. I believed him when he said she was different, that she loved him for who he was, not what he had or didn't have. I welcomed her. I cooked for her. I co-signed the lease on their first apartment when her credit wouldn't pass the smell test. I gave them the down payment for the house they called their forever home, a house I would never live in, never benefit from. But that's what family does, right? They build each other's dreams. The kitchen that night smelled like rosemary chicken. I had just pulled the casserole from the oven when the yelling started. Melinda's voice, sharp and rising, cutting through the warmth like a razor. Something about the guest list for the wedding, or maybe the budget. I honestly couldn't remember. The argument escalated so fast it felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold in slow motion. I turned to walk away, to de-escalate. That's when her hand grabbed my shoulder. That's when I stumbled back, hitting the counter hard. That's when the first blow landed, and the second. And the worst part wasn't the pain. It wasn't the blood or the shock or even the betrayal. It was Brandon, standing by the fridge, arms crossed, watching it happen. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't flinch, as if I were nothing more than clutter on his kitchen floor. When I hit the tiles, something inside me broke, and something else woke up. I lay there for a few seconds, trying to breathe, my ribs pulsing with sharp reminders that this wasn't just a family squabble, it was a turning point. Melinda stormed out, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. Brandon didn't follow her immediately. He stood there for a moment longer, staring at me like I was a stranger bleeding on his imported tile floor. Then he stepped over my legs and left without a word. I didn't cry. Not then. I'd cried enough over that man throughout my life. What I felt wasn't sadness. It was something colder, more precise, like a scalpel separating bone from rot. My phone was buzzing near my fingertips. Its screen cracked. I swiped to unlock it and saw his message. 4 words, "Stay away from us." I didn't respond right away. I stared at those words, letting them burn into my mind. Us, as if I'd attacked them, as if I was the danger in that room, as if my presence in his life was now a threat to be neutralized. I typed 1 word, done. I hit send with a stillness that felt unnatural. I sat up slowly, pain flaring through my side. My lip was split, blood crusting in the corner. I moved like an old machine. Every motion mechanical, every breath measured. I stood, wobbled, leaned against the counter. I took out the casserole and placed it on the stove. I didn't want it to burn. The absurdity of that hit me then. That even in this moment, I was still trying to preserve something. Dinner, dignity, sanity. I reached for a dish towel, dabbed at my lip, and glanced toward the small security camera above the pantry. It was something I'd installed last year after a break-in scare. I had forgotten it was even there. Until now. I pulled out my laptop, navigated to the footage. There it was, grainy but clear. Melinda's furious face, the shove, the blows, my fall. Brandon's silence, his exit. I copied the file to a secure folder named Just in Case. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet, but instinct told me to preserve the truth. That night, I slept on the couch, not because I couldn't make it to bed, but because the kitchen light stayed on. A reminder, a witness. And in the silence of that room, I whispered something I hadn't said out loud in years. No more. The next morning, I moved like a ghost through my apartment. My body ached in ways I hadn't known it could. There was a constellation of bruises on my ribs, dark and blooming. My lip was a swollen reminder of every time I had silenced myself for peace. But my mind was terrifyingly clear. I brewed a pot of coffee I didn't drink and stared out the window while the city woke up. Somewhere out there, Brandon and Melinda were carrying on as if nothing had happened. Maybe they were laughing about it. Maybe they thought I'd slink away, humiliated, disappear like a stain they could scrub from their shiny new life. But they underestimated the woman who raised Brandon from a boy who wet the bed to a man in tailored suits. They forgot who handled their taxes, their wedding deposits, their loan documents. They forgot I kept receipts. Literally. My first call was to Jessica, my oldest friend, the kind who doesn't ask, "Are you sure?" when you tell her something unthinkable. Her voice sharpened when I described what happened, anger rising with each detail. "You're calling the police, Evelyn, right now, and don't delete that footage. We're not letting this slide. Not this time." But I hesitated. Not because I doubted myself, but because I knew how my family operated. Brandon would cry, Melinda would spin the story, and suddenly I'd be the unstable one, the jealous sister, the bitter old maid who couldn't handle her brother moving on. I'd played that role before. I'd swallowed their versions of truth for decades. Not anymore. Instead of calling the police, I made appointments, one with a clinic to document my injuries, and one with a lawyer Jessica had used during her divorce, a woman known for dismantling egos and courtrooms alike. I also logged into my bank. There, in black and white, was the mortgage document. A $740,000 loan. Brandon and Melinda's forever home. And my name? Right beneath theirs, as guarantor, the foundation holding up their fantasy life. I hovered over the revoke button. A small blinking prompt appeared. "Are you sure? This action may have serious financial and legal consequences." I clicked yes. I verified my identity, answered 3 security questions, and with a calm that felt otherworldly, signed my name. A simple electronic flourish, and the entire house of cards began to shake. It didn't take long. The phone rang that afternoon. Brandon's name lit up the screen like a fire alarm. I let it go to voicemail. Less than 2 minutes later, another call came, then a third. On the 4th try, I picked up, more curious than anything else. His voice was pitched, panicked. "Evelyn, what did you do?" "The bank just called. They said the guarantor pulled out. They said the loan's dead. You just ruined everything." I let silence hang, a deliberate pause sharp enough to cut. "I did what you asked," I said calmly. "You told me to stay away. That includes my name, my credit, and my money." He sputtered, tried to pivot. "You don't understand. This is our home. We already gave notice at the apartment. We've put down deposits. The wedding, not my problem," I said, and hung up. I stared at the phone for a long moment, the stillness around me thick with something new. Not revenge, not even satisfaction, just clarity. That evening, the knocking started. It wasn't gentle. It was a pounding, animalistic, full of rage. I peered through the peephole. Brandon and Melinda stood outside, their faces twisted with disbelief and fury. They looked like people who had never been told no. "Evelyn," Melinda screamed, "open the door! You're ruining our future!" I said nothing. Brandon's voice cracked. "We can talk about this. Think of Mom. Think of what this looks like to everyone." Still, I said nothing. They kept yelling for several minutes, threats and pleas woven together in a grotesque symphony. I waited until the hallway fell silent before moving again. I blocked their numbers, disabled the doorbell, shut the blinds, and then I opened a new folder on my desktop and named it Evidence for Court. First went the video file. Next, the high-resolution photos of my face, the deep bruising, the medical report confirming blunt force trauma. I wasn't building a case for revenge. I was building a case for truth, a trail that couldn't be erased, denied, or twisted into something palatable for family dinners and fake smiles. That night, I slept better than I had in years. The silence didn't last. By morning, my voicemail was full, first from Brandon, then my Aunt Lorna, then my mother. The tone was eerily uniform, confused, disappointed, demanding. None asked how I was. None mentioned the bruises or the blood. They only wanted to know why I was making such a scene, why I was turning on the family. "Brandon told me everything." My mother's voice crackled through the speaker. "You've always been so intense, Evelyn, so emotional. This was bound to happen eventually. Don't throw away your relationship with your brother over one misunderstanding." Misunderstanding? I laughed, a sound sharp enough to startle myself. I was assaulted, in my kitchen, by a woman I had supported, housed, funded. And my brother, the boy I raised, stood by like a statue while it happened. And yet, here was my family, offering me the same tired script. Evelyn is too much. Evelyn takes things too far. Evelyn must have provoked it. No one asked about the footage. No one wanted to see proof, because to believe me would mean unraveling their entire version of family, a version where I existed to absorb blame, carry burdens, and never to demand acknowledgement. I didn't respond to any of the messages. Instead, I went to my appointment at the clinic. The nurse blinked when she saw me, her smile faltering. "You said you fell?" she asked, gesturing gently toward my lip. I nodded, then paused. "That's what the woman who hit me will probably claim." She looked at me, really looked, and nodded. "We'll document everything." The exam was thorough. The report detailed contusions along my ribs, a lacerated inner lip, and swelling consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. I took copies, digital and printed, and filed them carefully in my growing evidence folder. The next stop was Jessica's lawyer, Ms. Chambers. Sharp suit, sharper eyes. "Do you want to press charges?" she asked. No preamble, no judgment. "I want options," I said, "and protection." She nodded. "You have both. And the video helps. They may try to discredit you, but facts don't blink." I left her office feeling something unexpected. Not relief, not even hope, but strength. The kind that comes from finally refusing to explain your pain to people committed to misunderstanding you. That evening, a delivery came. A thick envelope, certified mail. It was a restraining order, filed by Melinda, against me. The audacity was almost admirable. The restraining order painted me as a threat, a dangerous, jealous woman obsessed with my younger brother's life and fiancé. It claimed I had harassed Melinda for months, sent threatening messages, and attempted to sabotage their wedding plans out of spite and mental instability. Reading it felt like being submerged in cold water. My hands shook. Not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of their fabrication. It wasn't just gaslighting. It was a calculated strategy to flip the narrative and destroy my credibility. They weren't afraid of me. They were afraid of what I could prove. The document was full of holes. No evidence, vague timelines, dramatic but unverifiable claims. But I knew that didn't matter. In a courtroom, perception could bleed into fact if presented well enough, and Melinda knew how to perform. I scanned the last page and felt a strange calm settle over me. So this was the game. So be it. I called Ms. Chambers the next morning. They're going on offense, I told her. She sighed. It's what abusers do when cornered. They preempt the truth. But this may actually work in your favor. How? Because now we get a court date, and you have evidence. I thought of the video, the photos, the messages, the medical report. I thought of Brandon's voice on the phone, frantic. Not because I was hurt, but because their loan had collapsed. I nodded. Then we go to court. In the days leading up to the hearing, the pressure mounted. My mother left a voicemail every morning, growing more unhinged with each message. You're tearing this family apart. Your brother is heartbroken. You need help, Evelyn, real help. She never once said, "Are you okay?" Even Aunt Lorna called, her voice syrupy and insincere. "Evelyn, honey, we're all just so shocked. Why would you do this to your own blood?" Because my own blood bled for them. Because I was done being the family's scapegoat. Because when someone burns the bridge you built with your bare hands, you don't try to rebuild. You light your own torch and find a new path. Jessica stayed with me the night before the hearing. We didn't talk much, just shared a bottle of wine and sat in the quiet, her presence reminding me that not all family has to be related. "You ready?" she asked. I didn't hesitate. I've never been more ready. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Intimate, uncomfortably so. The walls were beige, the lighting too warm, as if trying to trick you into thinking this wasn't where lives were dissected and reputations flayed. Jessica sat beside me, her hand resting lightly over mine. On my other side, Ms. Chambers organized her files with quiet precision. Across the aisle sat Melinda, Brandon, and of course, my mother. Melinda wore a cream-colored blouse and an expression of practiced fragility. Her eyes were lined just enough to seem tearful, and she dabbed a tissue at the corners of her mouth with dramatic frequency. Brandon looked thinner, paler. Not from guilt, I suspected, but from the stress of being exposed. And my mother, God, my mother, shot me a look so sharp it could have drawn blood. Her lips were pressed into a tight line, her eyes filled with betrayal, not for what had been done to me, but for what I had done in response. The judge entered, a woman in her late 50s, composed and unreadable. She opened the folder in front of her, scanning the documents quickly before nodding toward Melinda's attorney. The opening argument was a theatrical masterpiece. They painted me as mentally unstable, prone to delusions, obsessed with controlling my brother's life. They referenced my single status, my demanding job, even past family disputes that had no bearing on this case. Every word twisted into a weapon, every anecdote sharpened to wound. I watched Brandon as they spoke about me like a monster. He didn't look at me once. Melinda took the stand next. Her voice trembled, her hands shook. Oscar-worthy. She screamed at me in the kitchen. She whispered. She threatened to ruin my life. I was terrified. I almost laughed, but then the judge turned toward Ms. Chambers. Defense? She stood slowly, her presence calm and commanding. Your Honor, my client will not argue character today. She will present only facts, hard evidence. The air shifted. One by one, Ms. Chambers laid out the truth. The medical report, the photos, the time-stamped video. Gasps rippled through the room when the footage played. Melinda's violence unmistakable. Brandon's indifference haunting. The judge watched in silence, her jaw tightening. Melinda's face turned to stone. Brandon looked like he wanted to disappear. And my mother? She looked like someone watching a sandcastle crumble beneath a rising tide. The judge didn't look at me. Not at first. She stared down at the images on the screen, the paused footage showing Melinda mid-lunge, rage etched across her face. Then she looked at the medical report in front of her. The bruises, the torn lip, the narrative no one could twist anymore. Finally, she turned toward Melinda. Miss Barrett, she said, voice crisp, this footage clearly contradicts your sworn statement. What do you have to say for yourself? Melinda opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her fingers gripped the edge of the witness stand. The tissue she'd been dabbing her eyes with dropped to the floor. Brandon sat frozen beside her, lips slightly parted, his lawyer glancing at him with growing unease. I was scared, Melinda stammered. She's intimidating, always in control, and No, the judge cut her off. You're not answering my question. This video shows you shoving and striking the defendant. There is no provocation on camera. And Mr. Carter, she turned to Brandon now, her eyes narrowing. You stood and watched. You made no effort to intervene, to de-escalate, or to help. Brandon looked up, finally meeting her gaze, and for the first time in that courtroom, I saw what was behind his silence. Not shame, but fear. Not for what he'd done, but for what it now meant. The judge leaned back in her chair, let the silence stretch. I am denying the request for a restraining order, she said clearly. Furthermore, Miss Barrett, be advised that filing a false statement under oath is a criminal offense. And Miss Carter, she turned to me now, you are within your rights to pursue assault charges. You have clear grounds. I nodded once but said nothing. I didn't need to. Justice had already spoken. Melinda's face crumpled into disbelief. Brandon put his hand on her shoulder, but she flinched away from him. My mother covered her mouth with one hand as though realizing for the first time that the story she'd bought into wasn't true, and never had been. The gavel fell. Court adjourned. The room stirred, feet scraping the floor, whispers filling the air. I rose slowly, Jessica beside me, Ms. Chambers already gathering her papers. As we walked past them, Melinda looked at me, not with hatred, but desperation. Brandon tried to say something. Evie, I stopped. No, I said quietly. You stood over me on that floor and said nothing. From now on, we are strangers. The courthouse steps felt steeper than they had going in, but this time I wasn't carrying shame or doubt. I was carrying clarity. Jessica gripped my elbow like she knew I was holding back tears and pride in equal measure. The sun was high, but the wind was cold, slicing through the illusion that this day had been a victory parade. It wasn't. It was a funeral, and I was mourning something no one else had seen die. The version of my family I had fought so hard to believe in. As we reached the sidewalk, my mother called out behind us, "Evelyn, wait!" I turned. She was rushing toward me, her heels clacking unevenly, makeup slightly smudged. The woman who had once told me I was too ambitious to be lovable now looked like a child chasing a train already pulling away. "I didn't know," she said breathlessly. "I didn't understand." "You did," I thought. "You just didn't want to." "What did you think would happen?" I asked, my voice soft but sure. "That I'd stay silent forever?" Her lip trembled. "He's your brother." "He was," I corrected, "until he watched someone beat me and stepped over my body." She blinked. "He's sorry. He didn't mean..." "He meant everything he didn't say." I didn't wait for a response. Jessica and I walked away, my heels clicking in unison with hers like punctuation to the final sentence of a chapter I'd spent a lifetime editing for everyone else's comfort. That night, I sat alone in my apartment. The lights were dim, a single candle flickering on the windowsill. I scrolled through old photos. Birthdays, graduations, holidays. Brandon always in the center, everyone smiling toward him like he was the sun. And me? Off to the side. Cropped in every sense of the word. I deleted the album. Then I opened a new folder on my computer. This one wasn't for evidence. It was for me. Rebuilding, I named it. The first file I saved? An email confirmation for a Tuesday night pottery class I had just enrolled in. Something I'd always wanted to do. Something my mother once called a waste of time. I smiled. There was something poetic about turning formless clay into something strong, something new, something beautiful. And this time, the only hands shaping it would be mine. The first night of pottery class was awkward. I sat at a long table with strangers, some young, some older, none of whom knew me as the responsible sister or the dependable one or the woman who always had it together. They just saw a middle-aged woman with sore arms, slightly bruised knuckles, and clay under her nails, and that was perfect. The instructor, a soft-spoken man named Hugo, showed us how to wedge clay to release air bubbles. "You can't mold anything solid if the foundation is full of cracks," he said, hands pressing rhythmically into the lump before him. I almost laughed. Metaphors everywhere. My first attempt on the wheel was a mess. The clay wobbled, spun off center, collapsed under the lightest pressure. I cursed under my breath, drawing a chuckle from the woman beside me, a retired nurse named Lillian with paint-splattered glasses and a warm, knowing smile. "First time?" she asked. "First life," I muttered. She grinned. "Welcome to the mess. Sometimes you have to let it all fall apart before you can shape it." There was something healing about the act of trying, of failing without fear of judgment. My hands trembled less with each spin, each failed bowl and warped cup. Not everything needed to be perfect. Some things just needed to be mine. That week, I went to the farmer's market alone. I bought flowers, fresh bread, and a ridiculous jar of locally made jam, just because it made me smile. I played Nina Simone on repeat and rearranged my bookshelves by color instead of genre. Small rebellions, quiet reclaimings. I thought of Brandon less. When I did, it was a dull ache, not a fresh wound. I didn't miss him. I missed the version of him I thought was real. The big brother who looked out for me, who appreciated my sacrifices, who would have thrown himself between me and harm instead of walking away. But that version never existed. It was a character I had written for him, cast him in, and begged him to play. Now I was rewriting, for myself, and I had no interest in making anyone else the hero. One evening, as summer hinted at its return through warmer breezes and pink-tinged skies, a letter appeared in my mailbox. The handwriting stopped me cold. Brandon. It was unmistakably his, half cursive, half printing, the way he always wrote when he was trying to sound sincere. I stared at the envelope, fingers tightening involuntarily, the edges digging into my skin. For a long time, I didn't move. I didn't feel rage, or fear, or even sadness. I felt still. When I finally opened it, I was ready. The letter was 5 pages, handwritten, filled with misspelled apologies and poetic self-pity. Melinda had left him, it said. She'd taken the dog. The apartment was in her name. The wedding was officially canceled. He was seeing a therapist now. "Really working on myself," he wrote, like a badge of honor. He was sorry. Not for what he did, not for standing still while I bled, but for what it cost him. "I lost everything," he wrote. "I lost you." And suddenly I understood the real reason behind the letter. It wasn't remorse. It was regret. He missed the version of me that picked up his messes, shielded him from consequences, co-signed loans without hesitation. He didn't want me back. He wanted the idea of me, the use of me. I folded the letter in half, then again, then once more. I didn't cry. Instead, I thought about the last bowl I made in class. It was lopsided and had a crack that had formed during the drying process. Hugo had said most people would toss it, but if glazed correctly, it could still be functional. It could still hold something. Sometimes broken things could still serve a purpose, but not everything needed to be saved. I dropped the letter in the recycling bin without ceremony, and that was it. Not a climactic confrontation, not a dramatic reply, just closure. Soft, quiet, final. Later that night, I sat on my balcony wrapped in a blanket, sipping mint tea from my imperfect ceramic mug. I watched the city shimmer in the distance, alive with stories I wasn't part of, and I smiled. Not because everything was okay, but because I finally was. A week later, I stood in front of the Pottery Studio's display shelf, staring at the final product of my most recent creation. It wasn't perfect. The edges were uneven, the glaze bubbled in a few places, and a faint fingerprint remained where I hadn't smoothed the clay completely. But it was mine. Every flaw earned, every imperfection a choice I'd made in the process of shaping it. "Looks good," Hugo said from behind me, handing me a cloth to wrap it in. "Looks like truth," I murmured, and he nodded without needing more. That night, I hosted my first dinner in over a year. Just a few friends, Jessica, Lillian from class, and 2 co-workers who'd stood by me when everything imploded. My small apartment buzzed with laughter and the clinking of mismatched dishes. We sat around the table eating off plates I hadn't used since my last birthday with my family. I noticed something strange. I wasn't performing, not smiling too wide, or calculating every word to prevent discomfort. I was present, really fully here. At some point, Jessica leaned in and whispered, "You're glowing." I laughed genuinely, from my chest. "That's just garlic and wine." But she shook her head. "No, it's freedom." Later, after the guests had left and the candles had burned low, I washed each plate by hand. No rush, no resentment, just warm water, the hum of jazz in the background, and the memory of honest voices filling my space. As I dried the last fork, I glanced at my new mug, the crooked one, the cracked one, the one I refused to discard. It was still standing, still whole, and so was I. That night, before bed, I wrote something in my journal, a single sentence, in thick black ink. The home I was searching for was never a house, a person, or a past. It was peace, and I finally lived there. And for the first time in years, I slept without waking up once. There was a letter I never sent. It sat in my desk drawer, folded neatly inside a blank envelope with no address, no stamp, no intention. I wrote it months ago in the quiet fury of a night when sleep wouldn't come and memories pressed like fingers against old bruises. It was addressed to no one and everyone. A letter to my past, to my brother, to the girl I used to be. It began simply, "You don't get to rewrite me." I wrote about the kitchen floor, about the sting of betrayal sharper than the cut on my lip. I wrote about the silence after the blow, how it was louder than any scream. I described the look on Brandon's face, not angry, not guilty, just inconvenienced, like I'd spilled something. And I wrote about my mother, how her disappointment echoed louder than Melinda's fists. I poured it all onto the page, the decades of being the steady one, the safe one, the strong one, the one who swallowed hurt and called it harmony, the one who made herself small so others could shine brighter. I ended it with a promise, not to them, to myself. I will never again bleed for people who watch me die in silence. The letter never needed to be mailed. Its power wasn't in being read by them, it was in being written by me. A declaration, a liberation. I kept it as a reminder, not of pain, but of transformation. Some mornings I pull it out just to hold it, to remember the version of myself who sat in darkness and chose light anyway. That version, the survivor, the builder, the quiet warrior, is who I honor now. And as autumn crept in, the air crisper, the sky a deeper blue, I felt the shift not just in season, but in spirit. I was no longer recovering. I was evolving. I began writing more letters. Not for them, never for them. They were for me, for the pieces of myself scattered across a lifetime of shouldering burdens that were never mine to carry. One letter was to the 15-year-old version of me who took the blame when Brandon lost Dad's watch at a party. I reminded her that silence isn't virtue when it costs you your voice. Another was to the 24-year-old me who skipped her vacation to help pay off Brandon's credit card debt after Melinda's failed business venture. I told her she wasn't selfish for wanting rest. She was exhausted, not broken. There was a letter to my future self, too. That one was short. Don't let peace become background noise. Fight for it, every day. Each letter, each page, was like digging up a buried truth and polishing it into something sacred. With every stroke of the pen, I reassembled the woman I was meant to be. Braver, louder, untamed by guilt. Jessica saw the pile of sealed envelopes on my desk one afternoon and asked, "Therapy or vengeance?" I smiled. "Redemption." She nodded like she understood without needing to ask more. It felt good, this ritual, this deliberate honoring of my past, not as a chain, but as a foundation. Still, one letter lingered longer than the rest. I rewrote it a dozen times. It was addressed to my mother. Every draft started the same way. "I loved you more than I should have had to." Some versions ended in anger, others in grief, one or two in forgiveness that didn't feel quite earned. But in the end, I didn't keep any of them. I didn't need her to read it. I needed me to release it. So I burned it. On a cold, clear night, I took it to the park, placed it in a tin dish, and watched it curl into smoke. The flames didn't roar. They whispered. And for the first time, I felt the weight of her disappointment lift. Not because she changed, but because I no longer carried it like a mirror. It wasn't mine to hold, and in letting it go, I made room for something else. Grace. The next twist came when I least expected it. I was sorting through some of my old files, contracts, tax returns, dusty folders with fading ink, when I came across a manila envelope labeled simply, Morris House. My stomach tightened. The house. Their dream house. The one I'd helped them secure, the one they decorated with Instagram perfect filters and hollow gratitude. The one I'd pulled my name from like yanking a root out of poisoned soil. Inside was a copy of the original mortgage documents, and attached to it, something I hadn't noticed before. A hand-scribbled note from Brandon, back when he still wore the mask of a brother. Thanks for believing in us. Couldn't have done it without you. Love, B. The handwriting was rushed, but familiar. There was even a little doodle in the corner, a smiling face holding a house key. My name was printed on the page, bold and legal and binding. It hit me harder than the court hearing ever had. Not because I missed them, but because, for so long, I had believed that my worth was in what I could give. My credit, my time, my silence. This paper, this entire deal, had been built on my sacrifices, my responsibility, and they treated it like a convenience, a stepping stone, until I stopped being useful. That's when I realized something chilling. It wasn't just betrayal, it was strategy. I was the safe bet, the insurance policy, the invisible scaffolding holding up their lives, and when they no longer needed me, they didn't just discard me, they erased me. But here in my hands was proof, not just of what they took, but of how much I'd let them. I could have cried. I could have called Jessica and screamed into the phone. Instead, I picked up a pen and wrote something at the bottom of the page. Never again. Then I folded it up, not to burn, not to bury, but to keep. Not as a wound, as a vow. Because moving forward didn't mean forgetting. It meant remembering on my terms. The vow I made that night didn't stay confined to a folded piece of paper. It followed me into my choices, into my boundaries, into the way I began to speak up even in small, everyday moments, at work, in friendships, in the mirror, especially in the mirror. One morning, while sipping coffee on my balcony, I noticed something. The cactus I had bought after the court hearing, just a stubby defensive thing back then, had bloomed. A tiny, stubborn burst of pink peeking from its top. I leaned closer, stunned by the delicacy of it, how it defied the odds, how something so guarded could still dare to blossom. That's what I was doing, I realized. Not rebuilding, blooming, and not in spite of the scars, but because of them. I began journaling more intentionally, not about them anymore, but about the life I was shaping. My students at the community college where I taught, my neighborhood walks, my Tuesday pottery class, the way I had stopped apologizing for taking up space. One entry read, "I'm not who I was. I'm not who they said I was. I'm who I choose to be. Every morning, every mistake, every truth." It became a mantra, and the more I lived into it, the more the ghost of that old family system began to fade, not vanish, not completely, but soften, like an old scar that no longer aches in the rain. There were days I still heard my mother's voice in the back of my mind, reminding me to be nice, to not cause trouble, to just let it go. But those whispers had less power now. I would answer them aloud sometimes. I'm not that girl anymore. Then, one Saturday, after class, Lillian handed me a wrapped box. "What's this?" I asked. "Something you've earned." Inside was a simple clay plate, glazed in soft blues and greens. In the center, etched carefully in her looping script, were the words, "You get to write your ending." I held it for a long time. Then I smiled. Not because the past was gone, but because the story wasn't over. And this time, I held the pen. Years of my life, I believed survival meant silent endurance. I thought strength was measured by how much hurt I could absorb before breaking. But the cactus on my balcony, toothpick spines and all, taught me something different. It wasn't about enduring the harsh sun or dry soil. It was about daring to bloom anyway. That cactus arrived as a symbol. At first, I watered it carefully, almost timidly, terrified of overwatering, or worse, forgetting it entirely. Much like my own wounds, it reminded me that even the most resilient have limits. But when I saw that single, fragile flower bloom, I realized resilience wasn't about resistance. It was about renewal. And renewal, I decided, would be the theme of my next chapter. I began volunteering at the local women's center, offering to teach pottery workshops for survivors, women who carried their own bruises, their own silent horrors. I named the program Bloom in Silence. I didn't advertise its origins. The story wasn't mine to share. It was theirs to heal. The first class was small, 6 women ranging from 25 to 75, each with a story they weren't ready to speak. I got them started on basic forms, bowls, mugs, vases. Many were shaky at first, unsure of their hands, but with each spin of the wheel, I watched them gain confidence, hands steady, faces softening. They weren't just molding clay, they were reshaping their sense of self. After one session, a woman named Rosa, a survivor of domestic abuse, pulled me aside. "I didn't know I still had a voice," she said, voice cracking, "but it came back when I shaped that clay." Rosa's words echoed something inside me. Voice. I had found mine again too, not in loud declarations, but in quiet acts of creation, compassion, and boundary. The feedback from the center was overwhelming. More women signed up. My little apartment grew busier. My balcony bloomed with pots of succulents, herbs, and even that cactus, which now had 3 bright flowers. My life felt full, not because of grand gestures, but because of small, intentional ones. I'd been given so much: time, care, money, love. I realized the gift I could offer now wasn't rescue. It was presence. It was witness. It was honor. Many of these women had been unseen, unheard, and in the seat beside them, I could show up. I could plant a seed. I could water it. That's what Bloom in Silence became, not a project, but a promise. To grow, to heal, to choose light even in cracked pots. As I cleaned the pottery wheel that evening, clay-streaked and lightly scented with earth, I thought of the cactus again, how it thrived not in spite of adversity, but because it acknowledged it and used it. Survival hadn't changed. It had leveled up. By mid-fall, Bloom in Silence had grown into something I never anticipated. Not a charity project, not a part-time hobby, but a movement. It began with a photo. Rosa holding up her first finished bowl, smiling through tears. I asked if I could post it on my modest social media page, and she nodded, shy but proud. I shared it with a caption: "Some hands build shelters, some build weapons. Today, hers built peace." The post spread like wildfire. Messages poured in. Other centers asked if they could replicate the program. Survivors thanked me for giving them hope. Strangers sent boxes of clay, glazes, and even old wheels they didn't use anymore. It overwhelmed me at first. Not the attention, but the responsibility. I wasn't a savior. I wasn't a hero. I was just someone who had decided to stop letting her story be written by silence. Still, it felt like the universe was listening and responding. Jessica helped me set up a tiny website. Lillian offered to co-lead classes. One woman, a sculptor named Naomi, donated handmade aprons stitched with small embroidered phrases like "still standing" and "soft doesn't mean weak." The space filled with warmth. Not just from the kilns, but from laughter, shared glances, and the gentle healing that came from shared quiet. During one session, a woman named Priya molded a crooked vase. She stared at it for a long time, then said, "It looks like me," tilted, weird, but still holding space for something. Everyone in the room nodded, because we all understood. That became the mantra of the program, still holding space. And I realized something else. The people who once demanded my silence, who expected me to carry pain like a secret and endurance like a virtue, they no longer lived rent-free in my mind. Their voices, once booming, had become background noise. The volume belonged to me now. Not everything was perfect. Some days the grief still caught me off guard. A song, a scent, the way someone said my name could pull me back, but I no longer stayed there. I had roots now, not in people, but in purpose. And purpose, I learned, doesn't shout, it whispers. Like clay under your nails, like cactus flowers blooming in cold air, like a woman who thought she had nothing left, building something that saves others. I wasn't just healing, I was multiplying healing. The week before Thanksgiving, I received an email I almost deleted. The subject line read, "Invitation to Speak, Community Resilience Panel." I assumed it was spam, some generic outreach or mailing list, but something nudged me to open it. Inside was a personalized message from the director of a nonprofit coalition for trauma recovery. They had heard about Bloom in silence. They'd seen the photos, the testimonials, and they wanted me to speak, on a public panel about resilience and creative healing. I stared at the screen for a long time, not out of fear, but awe. Me. The woman who once couldn't say no without her voice shaking. Me, the invisible sister, the quiet fixer. Now being asked to speak publicly, not about perfection, but survival. About power. I clicked yes. When I told Jessica, she threw her arms around me. "Of course they want you," she said. "You've done more healing with clay and silence than some do with microphones." I spent the next few nights drafting my speech. I didn't want it to sound like a memoir. I wanted it to connect, to be a mirror for someone else who might still be stuck on their own kitchen floor, wondering if they mattered. So I wrote this. I was told my strength was in staying quiet, that being a good daughter meant being accommodating, invisible. But true strength? It's not how long you can carry pain. It's when you finally decide to put it down. My healing began the day I said, enough. And from that broken moment, I built something whole. I paused after reading it aloud to myself. That line, "I built something whole," wasn't about the program, or the mugs, or the classes. It was about me. The day of the panel, I wore one of Naomi's aprons over a soft linen dress. The word stitched into the pocket read, "Soft doesn't mean weak." I rubbed it gently as I waited backstage, grounding myself in that truth. When I stepped onto the stage, a room full of faces turned toward me. Women, men, young adults, elders, some smiling, some guarded, all listening, and I told them the truth. Not the whole story, just enough. Enough to plant a seed, enough to say, "You matter," even if they told you otherwise. When I finished, they stood, not just for applause, but in recognition, in solidarity. And in that moment, I didn't just feel seen, I felt believed. After the panel, I stepped out into the crisp evening air and took the longest breath I'd taken in years. It wasn't just relief, it was release. Jessica met me by the lobby doors, her face lit with pride. "You didn't just speak," she said, her voice warm. "You gave them permission." Permission. That word stayed with me on the cab ride home. Permission to heal, to walk away, to choose peace over performance, and maybe most importantly, permission to rewrite the story. The next morning, I found a small envelope wedged under my door. No return address. Just my name, written in a hand I hadn't seen in over a year. Brandon. I stared at it for a long time, debating whether to open it, whether I needed anything inside. But curiosity won. Inside was a single page. No excuses, no deflection, just a quiet, desperate scrawl. "I was wrong. I let her hurt you. I hurt you too. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know I finally see it." No signature. No request for contact, just acknowledgement. I folded it back up, placed it in the drawer with my other letters, the ones I'd written, the ones I'd burned, the ones I'd never sent, and then I did something I never thought I'd do. I smiled. Not because it fixed anything, not because I suddenly missed him, but because that version of me, the one who needed his apology like oxygen, no longer existed. This was closure on my terms. That afternoon, I returned to the studio. I shaped a new piece, a tall, narrow vase with a jagged rim and smooth, spiraling body. When I fired it, the glaze cracked in unexpected patterns, tiny fractures that shimmered gold beneath the finish. It reminded me of kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with lacquer mixed with gold. The idea that something wasn't less valuable because it had been broken, but more because it survived. I called the piece Inheritance, not from them, but from everything I'd rebuilt. That weekend, the women at Bloom in Silence passed the vase around the room. Each one touched it like it held a piece of their own story. And maybe it did, because sometimes healing isn't loud. It's glazed. It's fired. It's passed from hand to hand until it no longer belongs to one person, but to all who've endured. I used to think home was a physical space, a house, a family, a kitchen filled with the smell of Sunday dinners. I chased it for years, bending myself to fit into rooms where I was only ever half welcome. But standing on my balcony one morning, warm mug in hand, I realized something radical. Home had never been a place. It was me. It was the way I lit a candle at dusk. Not for ambiance, but because I deserved softness. It was the music I played while cooking for one. The scent of rosemary and garlic dancing through an open window. It was my breath, steady now, no longer clenched in anticipation of someone's disappointment. I had built something solid, brick by brick, not with mortar, but with choice. Choosing quiet when the world demanded noise. Choosing boundaries over bridges that only led to pain. Choosing myself, without apology. That morning, I received another letter. This time, not from Brandon. It was from my mother. I hesitated. Unlike Brandon's, her handwriting hadn't changed. It was tight, elegant, the script of a woman who still believed control meant correctness. I opened it slowly, not because I was afraid, but because I knew nothing inside could hurt me now. The letter was long, pages of justification, woven with half-hearted apologies. I was trying to protect the family. You always took things too personally. You have to understand it was complicated. I read every word. Then I folded the letter neatly, placed it in the recycling bin, and closed the lid. Not with anger, but with clarity. You cannot build a home with people who treat your pain like an inconvenience. Later that afternoon, I walked into the studio, greeted with hugs and the smell of clay dust and hope. Rosa handed me a new apron, deep green with soft pink stitching that read, "I am my own sanctuary." I slipped it over my head and smiled. Because I was. I no longer needed their version of family. I had created my own, not perfect, not bound by blood, but rooted in truth, in softness, in survival. That night, I lit a fire in the tiny ceramic bowl I'd made months ago, just a tea light. Just enough glow to remind me I didn't burn down bridges to escape. I lit a torch to guide myself home, and I was finally there. The evening after I discarded my mother's letter, I sat in silence, letting the absence of her words settle. Not everything needed closure. Some things simply needed to be released. As the candle flickered in the little bowl I'd made, I picked up my journal and began to write. Not to process, not to relive, but to mark the shift. A declaration. Today, I didn't beg for understanding. I didn't explain my pain. I didn't shrink. I simply lived. The more I wrote, the more I realized that forgiveness, for me, wasn't a door I had to walk through. It was a window I opened for myself, to let fresh air in after years of breathing someone else's stale expectations. That night, I took down an old frame photo from the hallway wall. It was from my brother's engagement party. Before everything fractured, everyone was smiling, but I could see it now. I wasn't smiling with joy. I was smiling for approval. I slipped the photo out of its frame and replaced it with something else, a piece of handmade paper pressed with lavender petals and the words, "This is enough." And it was. A few days later, I was at the studio preparing for our end-of-season showcase. Each woman in Bloom in Silence had created something to display. The energy in the room was electric. Nervous laughter, last-minute glaze touch-ups, heartfelt speeches scribbled on napkins. Naomi approached me with a box. "Open it," she said, eyes twinkling. Inside was a handmade sign carved from reclaimed wood, "The House We Built." I felt tears prick at the corner of my eyes. "This isn't just your studio," she said. "It's a home. You gave us a home when we'd forgotten how to live in one." And suddenly, I wasn't standing in a rented art space. I was in a sanctuary, a place where broken wasn't shameful, where silence wasn't empty, where creation wasn't performance, it was reclamation. That evening, as guests wandered the exhibit, admiring mugs with uneven rims and sculptures with chips and cracks, I heard someone whisper, "You can tell they put their whole story into this." And they had. So had I. And for once, that story didn't need to be cleaned up or rewritten to be palatable. It just needed to be told. I stood by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold and rose. Someone walked up beside me and said softly, "You look peaceful." I smiled, because I was, finally. A week after the showcase, I received another envelope in the mail, this time with no handwriting, just my name typed neatly on the front. Inside was a wedding invitation. Brandon. Again. Not his wedding, his divorce celebration. A backyard potluck, it read. No gifts, just stories, food, and moving forward. I almost laughed. It felt surreal. He was hosting a party to mark the official end of the marriage that fractured our family. And somehow I was on the guest list. For a moment, I considered throwing the invite away. But something stopped me. Not curiosity, not pity, closure. So I went. Jessica offered to come with me, but I declined. I needed to walk into that space on my own, unshielded. I wasn't looking for reconciliation. I was measuring growth. When I arrived, the backyard was strung with fairy lights. Fold-out tables groaned under the weight of home-cooked casseroles and fruit punch. People were laughing, mingling, clinking glasses. Brandon spotted me from across the lawn. He froze, then walked toward me, slow, unsure. "Hi," he said quietly, almost like a question. "Hi," I replied, steady. There was a beat of silence. Then he gestured toward a wooden bench beneath a blooming wisteria. "Can we sit?" I nodded. We didn't talk about Sarah. We didn't rehash the courtroom or the betrayal. Instead, he spoke of therapy, of learning how enabling isn't love, of how silence can be a weapon, of regret, not just for what he did, but for the years he let everyone else rewrite our story. He didn't ask for forgiveness, and I didn't offer it. But I listened, not because he deserved it, but because I did. I needed to hear for myself that my reality had not been a fantasy, that someone else finally saw what I'd endured. As the night deepened, he said, "You look different." I smiled softly. "I am," he nodded. "I hope you never lose this version of you." "I won't," I said. "She's home now." When I left, I didn't feel sad or vindicated, just done. Not the bitter kind, the clean kind, the kind that feels like setting down a heavy box you didn't realize you'd been carrying for decades. I walked home under a velvet sky, the stars peeking between tree branches like quiet witnesses. The wind was cool, brushing against my face like an old friend. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I just felt still. For so long, I had associated endings with grief, but this one felt different. It was soft, kind, a door closing with a gentle click instead of a slam. When I reached my apartment, I unlocked the door and was greeted by the familiar scent of eucalyptus and bergamot. My cactus was still by the window, now with 5 pink blossoms in full bloom. I touched one of the petals gently, delicate, resilient, like me. I walked into the kitchen, that same kitchen where it all began. The betrayal, the blood, the silence. But now, it wasn't haunted. It was healed. The counter held bowls I'd made, filled with fresh fruit. The fridge hummed. A teapot whistled softly on the stove. I realized I hadn't just reclaimed this space. I had rebuilt it. Later, I curled up in my reading chair, wrapped in a blanket, journal resting on my lap. I wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I chose to do with it. I chose to stay. I chose to rise. I chose to grow." There was nothing else to prove. No one left to convince. I had outgrown every version of me that believed pain was the price of love. Just as I closed the journal, my phone buzzed. A message from Naomi. "Someone asked today if we could open a second location. What do you think?" I smiled. Not because I had the answer, but because I finally had the freedom to consider the question. Growth didn't mean running faster. It meant expanding, thoughtfully. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of rain tapping gently on my window. No nightmares, no old memories clawing for attention. Just dreams of clay, and women laughing around a kiln, and homes built inside hearts instead of houses. And in the dream, I stood in front of a mirror. Not to fix, but to see. To witness the woman I had become. Whole, weathered, rooted, blooming.